Hey, what's up? And thank you for joining me for another episode of the Roots Podcast. So, while it is true that the original people of African ancestry that came to the Americas did so because of slavery, there are very, very clear examples of free people who also arrived in the Americas. Most notably would be Juan Garrido. He was a conquistador who marched alongside Hernan Cortez and took part in the conquest of the Aztecs. He was a man of African ancestry who was born in Africa, and when he arrived in Mexico, he was a free man. He's actually credited with bringing wheat to Mexico. He was the first person to plant wheat in Mexico, and he was of African ancestry. So, people of African ancestry probably had the toughest conditions of all people in the colonies. With indigenous people, it was a sort of mixed situation. There were indigenous people who, early on had been enslaved because they were captured in battle, or, for one reason or another, they had been displaced from their community, so they had to live in Spanish communities, and, they were exploited for their labor and maybe faced other types of discrimination. But there were also indigenous people who lived in their own communal lands, and 90% of indigenous people lived on communal lands in colonial Mexico. So for many of them in their day-to-day lives, they may not have ever seen Spaniards. And they had noble titles, they elected their own leadership. So it just depended on what community you were from. If you were from a displaced community and you were indigenous, you would have faced a tough time. But if you had your communal lands and your own elected leadership, your conditions would have been much better off. The issue with people of African ancestry is they didn't have separate communities. There was no, unless it was like a rebel community like the one created by Yanga. Very early on in the colonial period, he was an African slave who rebelled and created his own community. That's a very, very rare example. The overwhelming majority of people of African ancestry simply lived in Spanish cities and towns. They weren't even allowed to live in indigenous communities. Now, over time, the descendants of the original slaves were eventually free people, either through purchasing their own freedom, which was established in law. Slaves had the right to purchase their own freedom, and many of them actually worked side jobs for currency, and they would save up money and purchase their own freedom, or through interracial marriage, where a slave married a free woman, and under Spanish laws, children were free if the mother was free. It was like the law of the free womb. Or they could earn their freedom through exceptional service for the Spanish monarchy. So there were different avenues for freedom, so that by 1810, the year that Mexico declared independence, there were about 300,000 free people of African ancestry in colonial Mexico. So 300,000 free people of African ancestry lived in these towns across Mexico. Now, in that